Good morning, everybody. All right, that's a good way to start. So I'm gonna actually point out all the people in the back, all of you. Please come forward. I teach here. I can't get out of that role sometimes. I would really love it if you would consider moving forward. It'll aggregate our energy. We have a small enough group so that we can make this a real discussion, and would really love for you to be a part of that discussion in a real way. We're going to talk about impact investing, and we have two really fantastic guests to join us. Julia C., who has been an executive in wealth management and has built an impact investing firm and has her own advisory, and Rafa de la Guia, correct? Who's a principal at Omidyar and their investments group, and most notably a Haas alum. Julia went to that other good school that's in the region that shall not be named. And we are going to talk about the promise and the peril of impact investing. It is such a buzzy, hot topic, and there's so much money that now, so many assets that are under management that get this label of impact. And I personally don't believe that it gets enough scrutiny to really think about some of the high-level ethical issues around this, and then also some of the questions around potential unintended consequences as this market grows. So we're going to start the conversation. I asked Rafa and Julia to ask each other questions, and rather than give you really lengthy introductions to them, I also asked them to just contextualize their answers by talking about their different experiences in the field. And so you'll hear some of that. And when you have a question, we have a couple of different ways to do this. You can raise your hand, and if I'm not seeing you, you just keep it up and maybe wave a little. It's another reason to come to the front. And we've got a microphone that we're going to pass around if you want to ask questions as well. And so I think we'll dive into the questions relatively quickly into the conversation. But let's give them another round of applause, please, for joining us.
Thanks, Ben.
All right, so we talked a little bit about just the huge flood of assets into this category of impact. I guess my first question is, to what degree do you feel like this has actually made a real difference in solving problems?
Oh, we're going to start with the big question, are we, Ben? Yeah, okay, so my background is very, very quickly. So I started my career in the early 90s in the Asian equity markets. I was based in Hong Kong. I managed money in the public equities. It was a really wonderful time to be there. I had actually gone to school to do third world economic development work, and it was exciting to be there because it was right when China was opening up to foreign investment. Most of you guys were not even born at this time, but it was exciting because it was a big change. And if you look at some of the biggest numbers around poverty alleviation in the world, a lot of that has happened in China, right? Like a massive hundreds of million people moving out of poverty into this aspirational middle class. So that was exciting for me in that era of my life. I joined a firm that happened to have a long-standing relationship with China. Bank Indo-Suez had never left China, and so when I joined Indo-Suez Asset Management, we were part of the first group that was able to launch a Greater China Fund. And the only sort of skill set that I brought to the table is that I spoke fluent Mandarin Chinese, and all of my colleagues spoke Cantonese. And they were like, Julia, she's our China expert. So anyway, it was a really, really wonderful part of my career. I came back to the San Francisco Bay Area in the late 90s. And after a few years running a hedge fund in Asia, I had to transition careers. Honestly, I was a single mom with a young baby, and it was impossible to trade overnight and be in Asia every month. And so I went into wealth management at that point and managed money. I was chief investment officer for about 8 families and managed about $1 billion, which was fine. But going into the financial crisis in 07, 08, it became like I mean, if you guys remember that period, it was incredibly depressing. It was very, very morally disturbing to be in the wealth management industry. And that was when I discovered microfinance. I read everything that Muhammad Yunus and C.K. Prahalad and some of the others in the space, and I thought, oh my God, the ability to do good with capital seemed so enticing and so thrilling. And so since that period, since 2008, 2009, I have worked in the impact investing space in some fashion. First, building that business at Wells Fargo's Family Office Group. I then left to start Sonnen Capital, which is a dedicated impact investment management firm in San Francisco. And our thesis at that time in 2011, if you'll recall at that time, there were very few nonprofit, like Calvert had some work going on, but there were very few people like us who had come from traditional investment management that were trying to do impact investing well. And so we started that firm with that thesis. Like if we take all of I had an equity background, we had a fixed income guy, we had a venture capital guy, we had a private equity guy. So our idea was is if we could do it really, really well with this financial sort of rigor, that would be catalytic and interesting for the industry. So, and that's kind of my perspective on your question. So I've been looking at the impact investing space since 2008. I think it has. I mean, I would say my short answer is I think it has made a difference. I think you see on both ends of the spectrum, you see just the explosion in social entrepreneurship. I mean, I think it's been remarkable. I've been so happy. I was just saying to Ben that this is my 8th year in participating in some fashion in global social venture competition. I'm so proud. I'm so pleased. It's such a privilege to be here. And that has really changed the way I think about change, because I do think it's true. The underlying thesis around building an entrepreneurial infrastructure, I think, is true. That is how you solve problems. On the other side, it's the big corporations, the change that you see at Apple, the change that you see in terms of their supply chain and how they source products, Home Depot and how they source their lumber. So the big corporate awareness that you and I are engendering, I think, with our shareholder activism and proxy voting is making a big change. So I feel like I'm talking a lot, so I'm going to stop and throw it over to Rafa, but I think there's more to discuss in this area.
But you would say the answer is yes?
I would say the answer is yes.
Okay.
I believe it.
And we'll come back to, you made a differentiation around shareholder activism versus the injection of capital
That's
for
right.
impact.
That's right.
That's a great thing to come back to. Rafa, what do you think?
Yeah, my background, very quickly, is from very traditional finance. I started in investment banking, M&A. In the mid-2000s, that I moved into private equity. When the crisis hit, I moved from being an investor to be a restructuring expert, I think. I was doing a lot of quasi-equity investments, so all of a sudden, all of those companies were still performing, but financially, they were getting into default. Then I moved to Mexico. I always had this idea of doing something that was marrying investing and social impact. At the time, it was not even called impact investing. I think at those times, pioneer firms like Acumen Fund or Ignia call it patient capital.
Right.
And I moved to Mexico to start a different type of impact investing firm that was not doing venture capital investing, but was doing quasi-equity. And I think that's important in the context of this conversation, because I think we always talk about impact investing. I think maybe that's my lens. A lot of it is thinking about very early stage investing, equity investing, and there's so many things that can be done, and there's capital that play a role in all these different stages in the capital structure. So that firm, it's a relatively small vehicle, like a $30 million vehicle in Mexico. Then they raised another one, and I came to Haas. And actually,
changed your whole life?
Changed my whole life. That's how actually I met Julia the first year that we were organizing, that I was organizing the GSVC and the Social Impact Conference. And I've been then in early stage impact investing ever since. I was for a while at Acumen Fund as a summer intern, then a pro bono consultant, my second year of school, helping them open what is the Colombia office today. And then I joined Omidyar network. And at Omidyar, I've been doing a lot of emerging markets. I started doing mobile investments in emerging markets and Latin America at large. And over time, we have specialized and started working in industry and in segments, which is, I think, another consequence of more capital flowing into the space. We had a lot of generalist funds 5 years ago. I think now people are starting to become more specialist, and I think that's, in my opinion, that's pretty positive for the sector. And I've been focusing on education for the last 3 years, both in the US and in Latin America.
So hearing Julia and Rafa talk about their backgrounds makes me curious actually about our group here. Could you raise your hand if you are somebody who is an impact investor?
Yay.
Okay, so we've got some investors in the house. Okay, and what about if you're a student here and interested in maybe joining an impact investing firm? Okay, a lot of those hands.
Awesome.
And how about entrepreneurs that are potentially seeking investment? Okay.
Excellent.
All right, so pretty mixed.
Oh, good. Nice mix.
Group, yeah, and some other categories for people who didn't raise their hands. So it's something we were chatting a little bit about recently, Julia, the interplay of philanthropy and impact investing. In some ways, the rise of impact investing has changed the conversation about how we solve problems. And I think, you know, philanthropy is, at business schools, in my opinion, is often devalued and not really understood for the role that it plays as maybe a first risk dollar in for social change. And I love Omidyar's view of the spectrum where, you know, you invest for 0% financial return in some cases, philanthropically, all the way up to full market returns in other places. But you've had the opportunity to work at a place that had those two things together also.
That's
and impact investing was new to the DNA at Arabella, I believe, when you were there.
That's right.
There are some people that would just rather see impact investing replace philanthropy. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, I think that's a terrible idea. I think that's a terrible idea, and I do want to offer a shout out to Omidyar, because I think when they first started, it was really innovative and really sort of provocative, that idea of kind of having this whole spectrum of using philanthropy dollars, program-related investment dollars, mission-related investment, like this whole idea that companies are at different stages of the development. And I studied it extensively. I really admire that model. So I think that's a terrible idea, because I think there are a lot of things that just require philanthropy. I mean, there are sectors.
Why is that?
So, I mean, there are certain sectors out there that simply don't have a revenue model or an asset appreciation model. So if you're supporting HIV/AIDS clinics in some parts of Africa, there just is not a revenue model. I think early stage, a lot of the early stage charter schools, for example, in certain parts of India that are trying to figure out some sort of sustainable revenue model, it's not super, super effective. And so I think there are certain things that just require philanthropy. I also love the idea of using philanthropy to catalyze change. That is to say, so for example, I've been studying food and ag quite a bit for the last 2 years for an initiative that we launched to invest in food systems. But the Rockefeller Foundation, for example, a year or two ago, released $100 million. It was $100 million of philanthropic capital to help come up with solutions to reduce food waste globally, which was super powerful, because it was everything along the spectrum. So it was investing in early stage entrepreneurs who had ideas, it was investing in research, it was investing in landscaping. And the idea was to use philanthropic capital to find ways to promote opportunities for entrepreneurs where there were, and to solve problems. And a lot of times, I think in the social entrepreneur space as well, there's technical assistance that's required for startup businesses. And so I think it's all very powerful. My favorite part about the interplay now between impact investing and philanthropy is where you're starting to get some overlap. You're starting to see some not-for-profits that are looking for ways to build their own financial sustainability using impact investing. So Nature Conservancy, for example, a few years ago built out this Nature Vest part of their business, if you're familiar, which is a partnership with JP Morgan, and they've issued some of these investment notes, et cetera. So it gives investors and philanthropists different models and tools to use, different ways to access their capital, and it gives not-for-profits ways to tap into different parts of the capital scheme, which I think is super powerful.
What do you think, Rafa?
I mean, one of the things that we talk about a lot at Omidyar Network is trying to use system-level thinking for social change. So if you start thinking about some of these segments, education, healthcare, agriculture, there's a lot of things that need to happen to affect social change. There needs to be policy change, there needs to be great organizations that scale up, and I think, again, there's different pieces of the puzzle that may require different capital intervention. So I am very concerned when all of a sudden it's like, you know, with the hype of impact investing, it seems like everything needs to be done with impact investing vehicles. I think creates a lot of pressure on an industry that is very nascent to perform. I think, you know, a lot of these, another way of looking at this as well is like, well, you need pioneers in the sector. And I love what you mentioned. I think, I rephrase like philanthropy is the R&D of the social sector. That should be kind of like, you put capital, you don't know where it's coming. That's why you have, by the way, tax advantage dollars, because you're trying to do that. And for example, if I look at some of the industries that we have invested in, like financial inclusion, we have invested in for-profit companies that we hope will get like massive scale and create a lot of social impact and hopefully a lot of like financial returns. I think there's important to think about social impact as kind of like how many people you're like reaching and how deep you're reaching. And some of the maybe more philanthropic approaches can have a very deep reach, but not a lot of like impact across the board. And the other thing that I think it's important is like you have infrastructure for sectors. And infrastructure traditionally has been played by the public sector. And I think we are in an era where a lot of the public sector is getting defunded and like around the world, a lot of demographic pressure, a lot of like, so what is the role of philanthropy there? And I think that plays a big role. And how you combine both. So we will put philanthropic dollars or what we call like sub-commercial return, like for-profit dollars in things that we are building infrastructure for a sector. If you think about the microfinance space, for example. And then we will put for-profit dollars into some of these social ventures that maybe we have the risk the market with philanthropy, with impact investing. And now we are opening the gates for more commercial investors to play a role. I think it's positive to your first question. I think it's positive that there's more money coming into the space. I think the philanthropic sector in the US is 2 to 3% of the total economy. So how you make sure that we give, that we mobilize another 90% plus of the capital, but it's important to think where each player is playing a role.
I was going to ask you, Ben, because I know you lead the Center for Social Sector Leadership here. How has the whole evolution in how people think about philanthropy and impact investing, how does that affect how you teach and what you think about in your classes?
That's a great question. Thank you so much for teeing me up, Julia. Well, I think the reality is increasingly the next generation of leaders are way more agnostic to legal structure that really defined the way people in Gen X and even Gen Y and boomers and beyond made career choices. People are interested in going to dynamic social impact organizations and that are really good at solving problems and have, especially from business school, have entrepreneurial cultures and clear definitions of success. And so sometimes that's a nonprofit. And so so I'm teaching a class now on social impact strategy and leadership, and it's about the differences between managing across different sectors, but really acknowledges that there's a sort of core thread around problem solving and points out some of the key differences. And I think that that's a good trend.
I do too.
I think it's nonprofit is arguably the worst term ever for the sector. And it just refers, for people that don't know, refers only to the fact that nonprofit organizations cannot distribute profits to owners of a company, but you can certainly make profits and be entrepreneurial and earn revenue. So that's the quick answer.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. So I'd love to open it up to the audience if any of you have a question at this point. In the back?
Yes.
Can you speak up?
Yeah, sorry. You mentioned earlier that there were some morally responsible aspects of I was wondering if you could elaborate.
Oh, we want to get into the dirt, is that right?
We only have 30 minutes, Julia.
So what I was referring to in that specific...
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, so the question was, I had referred earlier during the financial crisis to sort of the morally corrupt, some of the really issues that troubled me as a person working in the wealth management field. And what I was referring to specifically during the financial crisis was I felt like all of us who worked in money management were being tarred by the same brush of the Madoffs of the world, essentially, that it was fraudulent, that we were using other people's money for our own gain. And I worked at Wells Fargo at that time. I was in their family office, and I managed money on behalf of others. And it felt brutal, actually, to go to work every day and be the kind of person that you sort of read about on the news that was doing a kind of work that seemed heartless and soulless and had a very, very narrow goal to it. Like, really, you were just trying to help wealthy people make more money. And I had come out of school wanting to do work around third world economic development, and so it was soul crushing for me to be in that field, and so I had to figure out ways. And by the same time I had obligations. I was a single mom, I had a little kid, and so I had to do something with myself. And so the way that it first manifested for me was I worked for a living, and then I served on a number of not-for-profit boards. I did a lot of volunteering. I dragged my son with me on every kind of not-for-profit thing that I could figure out. And so when I first heard about impact investing, this idea that you could combine doing something better in the world with a financial or investment background, I was kind of thrilled to pieces. So that was what I was referring to specifically. I do think now, this is, I know later in our conversation perhaps, but there's a very, very big pressure right now for the publicly traded part of impact investing to outperform or at least be competitive versus its traditional benchmark. So does your US equity thing outperform or perform as well as the S&P 500 benchmark? And I think a number of firms have done a good job trying to demonstrate that you can do just as well while not investing in fossil fuels or guns or whatever it is that you're opposed to. But I think fundamentally there's a problem with that question, because I think a lot of businesses are very extractive, they're very exploitative, the externalities aren't taken into consideration with a lot of these indices. So I'm not sure the question is right. Like, I'm not sure what I want to do is to be able to outperform the S&P 500. So this is a more complex question. It's a conundrum that I struggle with all the time, but that's an aspect of investing right now which is troubling to me, is just, do we want to prove that we can outperform an index which has all of these externalities that aren't being counted in? So it's more than he asked. But.
No, it's great. And you just made me, you made a good segue to one of the other questions that I had on our list, which is really sort of about offense versus defense.
Yeah.
Part of the problem I have with the umbrella of impact is that there's not a real differentiation at this point between the do no harm of ESG screens and the additionality of creating social impact that wouldn't happen if not for a new category of capital willing to maybe be concessionary in its returns.
Right.
Do you agree with that? How do we manage that going forward? Mindful of the fact that you want to bring capital markets along, that it's a good thing that the BlackRocks and TPGs of the world care about this now.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the new players in the space are like raising money with that kind of like, the same way that it was greenwashing 10, 15 years ago. I think there's a lot of that. Having said that, I'd rather have a TPG or a BlackRock with certain orientation toward impact than non-orientation at all. And I think there's a risk on being, I think we need to be a bit pragmatic as well. I think that put us more honest, I think maybe on foundations or some of the more traditional impact investors to be very honest about the type of work that we're doing and not try to start moving more towards the easy wins or the more commercial capital. And I think we see that as our role. The moment that we see that space, you know, we try to move into what is the next frontier market, where is the next area where we can be that R&D and that innovation. But having said that, for me personally, I think that's very positive, particularly if you're not using tax advantage dollars. I think it's very different if we were starting to see, you know, some people that start moving from like, you know, their endowment and start investing tax advantage dollars in things that are not having real impact and are like still like talking about it in a certain way or family offices. But yeah, that is my, I mean, I'm more of a pragmatic person and I'm okay with that. There's some like risk about devaluating, I guess, what we talk about impact, what we're talking about.
I mean, I agree with that. I'm pragmatic too. I think there's enough confusion, there's enough gray area in the impact investing space to try and like recategorize as complicated. But I've been thinking a lot about this because I work with a foundation now and they've structured their corpus in a way, and these are very, very smart, very sort of forward-thinking people in the impact investing space. And they've structured their corpus, the way that they envision it is a triangle. And on the base, they have the publicly traded stuff. So the bulk of their portfolio is still in public equities and public fixed income globally. And they've done the best they can to transition their previous managers into, you know, a Boston Common or an Aperio or groups that are doing the best they can. These are environmental sustainability people, so they want fossil fuel free and they want investments in companies that are investing in renewable energy and energy efficiency, those kind of things. So that's the bottom and the biggest part of their pyramid. They have a middle section which is kind of thematic investments. So they care about things like affordable housing, and so they're looking for fixed income opportunities, private real estate opportunities. Things are still more or less commercially driven, but very intentional in trying to address something thematic. And then the very tip of their triangle, the smallest part, they've actually carved out 10% of their corpus for what they consider a high impact carve out, and the intention is to build upon their programmatic grant budget and figure out a way to be very catalytic, very high impact in a few ways where the additionality is very important. Like if not for their capital, this wouldn't happen. So it could be first loss, it could be technical assistance. It could be something along those lines. So it's an interesting way to think about it, the way that they've approached it.
Interesting. Yes.
So this is a question I think very much along the same lines, but I've noticed that folks at Omidyar are really excited about the kind of rise funds that they have, and really engaging there. And so I was curious if you could speak a bit more to where you see the additionality potentially existing, particularly in light of your mention of sort of the importance of not just seeing venture capital in that early stage high risk investment as the only piece of the impact spectrum.
Did you say Omidyar is enthusiastic about TPG's Rise Fund?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like Pierre sits on the advisory board. We made an investment. I think for us is like this idea of like we typically invest in Series A, Series B rounds. We do some seed investments, and I think that ecosystem, it's far from fully developed in many of the emerging markets, but you still start to have more and more capital. If you have like, I think a Rise Fund close with 1.5 or $2 billion, all of a sudden you have people that can put big tickets at work, which was not the case a few years ago. So for me, we've seen like Rise investing in companies that we either invested or looked at now. We have co-invested with Rise. For example, the last deal that I did was in something pretty similar to a bootcamp model, but like serving lower middle income populations at a pretty low price point. A lot of people may be like, well, you're still charging for it, and we're starting to get in all these things. But for me, like the fact that they are coming in and leading a $20 million round, and all of a sudden this model can expand in 3 different countries as a price point that is accessible for lower middle income population, it is a game changer. Because other than that, they will have to, like self-sustain, grow slowly. So I believe that is pretty positive. When I look at their portfolio, I think there's a lot of things that make a lot of sense. There's some others that maybe you take a little bit of a leap of faith and it's like, well, they're just like mobilizing money for the mass market. But it's also true that for many years, like when you look at like the private equity investments in India, in China, in some other places, it was like the top 5, 10%. It was like, how will we build malls or luxury brands or things like that? So if people want to go to the kind of like the middle of the pyramid, the diamond, I would say, which is like 60, 70%, I think there's additionality there. Of course, they're doing it for returns, but I personally I'm fine with that. Again, the risk is if everyone wants to move into that space now because they believe that there's where the money is, which I believe that if I was like a hedge fund and I'm doing just for returns, that's where I will probably place my money. Then you enter into some issues, but yeah.
You want to comment? No? Okay, thank you. Gentleman in the back. Thank you.
Thanks. So I read a really compelling article recently by the CEO of Bally, the Building Local Economies group, and it was called Wealth Inequality and the Fallacy of Impact Investing. And so I'm a big impact investing evangelist, so obviously that was a very attention-grabbing, headline for me. But I think the argument he was making there is that more and more we find these mainstream investors coming into the impact investment space, and that we should be perhaps concerned about this, and the idea that the folks who have proactively driven so much wealth inequality throughout the world are now more and more also leading the impact investment space and being the ones to reap the rewards from it. And so while they are investing in different types of entrepreneurs and businesses, they're the ones who continue to extract a lot of the wealth and the benefits from that. So I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with that, but I would like to hear from your perspective, obviously being in the space and being leaders in it yourselves. Is that something we should be concerned about, about this space being maybe assimilated and mirroring traditional financial markets?
I want to add
Please.
part B and C. It's a great question. I would love to hear you talk about the dangers of greenwashing. And for people that don't know the term, essentially means that somebody claims the halo of being a do-gooder without doing the good and gains the premium from that. So you had mentioned it earlier, Rafa. What are the potential long-term dangers? I'd love to hear you both talk about that. And then, the other part reminds me of something you said earlier, Julia, which is, so if private equity firms are now driving impact investing, how do we net out the potential damage of the outcomes of leveraged buyouts that result in chain stores like Toys R Us going out of business,
Right.
and the negative externalities from LBOs that may emerge from the same groups that are now trying to do the impact investing.
So many questions.
Sorry, but you spawned a really great piece of this conversation.
So, you know, it's interesting because like a lot of the earliest impact investors, the big foundations, were actually family foundations of those who had built their wealth on fossil fuels, right? Or so, you know, Rockefeller Brothers was actually one of the first foundations that came out, and they were like, no more fossil fuels. And it was great because I think the new generation, the Gen 3, Gen 4, Gen 5, whatever, were recognizing that they had built their wealth on what had been really things that are causing this generation a lot of trouble, and so they were trying to rectify that. I've also worked with a Seattle-based family foundation that had been built on timber, and so they had, you know, and I think at that time it hadn't been a really sustainable timber strategy. And so the fifth generation of that family foundation as well was trying to, you know, invest in renewable energy. They were doing a lot of land conservation, and the idea was to sort of try to make up for some of the damage that had been done. So I don't know. I don't have judgment about that insofar as I feel like the previous generations were unaware or unwilling to look at what the consequences were. And one of the reasons I love coming here is actually I feel like you don't have to explain this to anybody who's under the age of 30 anymore. Like everybody understands that there are consequences to all of the actions that we take. And so my biggest frustration in impact investing is that there continues to be what I think is a really distinct generational divide. That is to say, people who are in business school, who are in college, perfectly understand the issues around social and environmental sustainability, and yet the keepers of the wealth, the vast majority of the keepers of the wealth at pension funds, at big sovereign wealth funds, at you know, a lot of the big endowments are still managed by an older generation who, many of whom still find this kind of an irrelevant conversation to them, and that I find really frustrating. So I'm happy to be part of this crowd, but I think even though the amount of money that's ostensibly in sustainable investing or impact investing has grown dramatically, it's still a tiny, tiny piece of a gigantic pie. So I think there's much, much more work to do, and so rather than stomping on some of the aspects of greenwashing, I'd rather sort of hold up the people that are doing a really good job. And right, I'm celebrating. Let's celebrate the ones that are doing a good job. And it's imperfect. I've been in the space for 10 years now. It is just massive amounts of gray area. Like every time you try to do something good, you're putting solar panels on your house, and then you read about like the destructive nature of the batteries in your solar panels. It's so depressing. You buy yourself a hybrid or whatever, and like that's polluting in another way. So it's imperfect in practice. But I think, like Rafa, I'm also very pragmatic, and the more that we do, the more awareness that we can generate, the better solutions we can come up. I know this is like one portion of the question, but I've kind of run out of juice.
Okay.
I'm going to hand it over to Rafa.
I mean, I think the question that you ask, I think it's not just about impact investing, and that's a separate conversation. I think in today's economy, there's a tremendous concentration of wealth, and it's only going in that direction, and that creates all sorts of issues. But one of my principles in investment, and I would say in life, is a structure drives behavior, and there's a lot of incentives in the system that creates this accumulation of wealth, and I think that's a conversation to have a bit as society. I think a lot of people that were not expecting to have this wealth, you know, like Pierre Omidyar started eBay, and 2.5 years later, in his late 20s, like it went public, and he became a billionaire overnight. And if you talk to him, he doesn't believe that he deserves it. He's a very different, that kind of like the aristocracy in Europe that is like, well, this is our, you know, blood right. So that how he decided to kind of like do something about it. So people that are like signing things like the Giving Pledge and try to mobilize that capital, I applaud it. And I think a lot of the people that are doing that, I think back in the day, you have the two separate pockets of money. This is how I make money, and this is how I feel good about myself. But I think a lot of people are trying to change their own businesses to move into more inclusive type of businesses. And public markets create a lot of tension, which is another incentive that we need to rethink as we think about impact investing, because I think if we manage to change some of the short-term view of how we manage money in general, that will change dramatically how some of these big companies work. The risk in greenwashing for me back in the day was like, you had a lot of fossil fuel companies, a lot of like companies that were creating a lot of harm, arguably, that were putting 1%, 2% of their budget in their CSR, but that was where they were blasting 80% of their marketing, right? So for me, the fear might be if you start having some of these big M&A transactions or leverage buyouts, is if you have big corporations that have no intention whatsoever to change the way they do business, but they have these token things where they can be like, well, but I acquired this, $20 million organic brand. I'm still like, with my 5 or 10 billion, seats. Well, anyway, I don't want to name names, like doing whatever. So I think that's a little bit of the risk there. With the greenwashing, I'm not sure we are there yet. And with with private equity, leverage buyouts, the financial engineering, and this gets more of like people are thinking about being entrepreneurs and things like that. The same way that I think philanthropy has created some harm with mission drift, when you enter and you have a programmatic goal and you tell the entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, like you need to go in this direction instead of to react to the market. When you give part of your equity to a different type of investor, you need to know what their goal is. And I think that's where every single transaction becomes very important, because when we make a new investment and we bring in a tier 1 commercial investor, we want to make sure that we are all aligning the vision for that company, and hopefully that our vision for impact and the vision for this as a business to grow go in the same direction. And I think that as an entrepreneur, as an aspiring entrepreneur, as a co-investor, you just need to have those hard conversations to make sure that you're going in the same direction. And if it's like my vision is that I want to put 5 times EBITDA or 10 times when I was doing private equity in Europe in this company and flip it and sell it in 3 years, then probably you're going to take shortcuts. Probably it's not the same direction. But funders are more aware now than they were. There's more capital. They have a bit more choice. And I think also the role of traditional impact investors sometimes is counterbalance that and have a conversation.
So this makes me think of, at Skoll, I was at Skoll last year, and we had a conversation that was very interesting, actually. There were 2 people who had written a paper which essentially said, the hype around impact investing is completely overdone, and it's actually very damaging. And the thesis was based on this idea, and these were people who are working bottom of the pyramid, mostly in emerging markets, at poverty alleviation type strategies. And their thesis was the sort of pressure from impact investors was changing the underlying thesis that entrepreneurs had. That is to say, if your original goal had been to address, the lowest income communities, and then you got in some impact investment capital, and all of a sudden they had these 3 or 5 year goals, or they had to prove to their investors that the returns were competitive to some other early stage venture capital type investment. Therefore, then the entrepreneur had to pivot, and all of a sudden they were addressing sort of the middle market as opposed to the lowest income market. And their thesis was that impact investing was therefore changing the dynamic. If it were just philanthropic capital, for example, then these people could focus on their initial goal. And it was a really, really interesting debate. I think the conclusion that we came at the end of this hour-and-a-half conversation was there's just very different kinds of capital. And it's true that entrepreneurs have to be more demanding of the kind of capital that they accept. If they can, it's very hard. I've been an entrepreneur. At the beginning, I'll take anybody's money, really. But to have that conversation, like, are your goals, are your objectives aligned? Can you use the right kind of capital to build out your vision of the business, right? But it's hard, I mean.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's a capital markets problem because, to the point I made earlier about wanting to focus on social impact organizations agnostic to legal structure.
Right.
You could make the argument that we need a much more efficient social impact capital marketplace that understands, that actually hews somewhat to the spectrum of returns approach at Omidyar.
That's right.
To answer that question and avoid those moral hazards.
Right.
I have a question in the back there.
Thank you. Biographies are always written backwards. Everything makes sense afterwards. Can both of you address mistakes that you made and why you did what you did and what you learned?
Oh, how much time do we have? You're younger, Rafa, you start.
Yeah. So I think the impact investing space, for example, and Omidyar was a big part of that, was like the microfinance space. And I'm not saying that microfinancing itself is damaging, but I don't think it's a silver bullet. And I think the moment that a lot of the microfinance market were starting to be a bit proven, so much inflow of capital went there with this idea like it's going to solve so many other problems, and that I don't think the evidence was there. And I think that was a mistake of the sector. Like if you start like doing $200 million, $500 million, $1 billion credit lines, and that I think sucked a lot of capital from other areas, and this idea of like jumping into the hype. A lot of people were doing non-profit work, all of a sudden restructure and started doing for profit basis, IPOs. So if you think about that, I think, you know, like maybe a bit more of a patient approach and not like, oh, we got it, like this is the next big thing, whoosh, let's open the gates. That was probably a big mistake. And I think when I started doing impact investing at the very beginning, now thinking more about like very early stage, I think there was from a while, and I think I still have entrepreneurs that come to me and is like, well, I'm debating whether to do a non-profit or a for-profit, but I think I should do a for-profit because there's impact investing there, or I should change and I think that creating that hype put a lot of pressure on the entrepreneurs doing the work. And I think that's why we need to raise the voice of other type of capital instruments that maybe allow you to not grow 5, 10x year over year because that's the expectation of your investor, but grow 50% instead of 10% and reach more people and go deeper.
So I feel like it's interesting for me personally because I have myself been an impact investor for the past 10 years, and then I've invested on behalf of clients, of course, and I've done such a better job for my clients. Because as it turns out, as a personal investor, I have led entirely with heart. Like I have invested in a number of early stage businesses that I just loved the story, or I loved the entrepreneur, or it was a sector that was really near to my heart. And those have all been, frankly, disasters, actually. I don't think I've gotten a penny back from any of those investments, which makes me feel bad as a professional investor, like that I've been a disastrous personal investor in impact. And I admit this here, and I hope this doesn't go out like on the Twitter.
To the world. No, I'm just kidding.
And I guess the mistake there is, on behalf of clients, I take a very, very rigorous approach. Like I am looking at the risk and return, I am looking at the impact proposition, I'm weighing all of those like you would a normal investment type person. And the difference has been for my personal portfolio, I have led with heart. And I don't know if it's a mistake. I'd probably still do the same thing because I think they were the right investments to make. But financially, I should have categorized them differently in my in my personal ledger. So, Ben, how come you got let off from this question?
I know. Next question. But I do want to I want to bring up something that you referenced, short-termism.
Yes.
Is there any hope on the horizon? You know, you hear people sometimes, like I heard Kat Taylor not that long ago.
I was going to say more women on boards might help, more women CEOs might
But she
help.
sort of refuted the legal status quo of what a fiduciary means and thought that there was legal room to revisit that. And then, of course, you have to deal with shareholder activism. But do you see from where you sit any significant shift away from short-termism?
So, I mean, like, I play in the very early stage, which I think is slightly different. One of the things that I see is like funds are, either we have evergreen funds, a lot of the kind of like the Omidyar, Zuckerberg, all these entities are like LLCs. They don't have, I think that's one of the luxuries of having just one LP. You don't need to return capital in a given period of time. You don't need to show an exit in the next 3 or 5 years, so you can go and raise your next fund. So I think a lot of these structures allow for that, to take a little bit of a longer term view. But I also see funds that used to be 10 years and now they're 12 years. And the expectation in like returning capital is, I think, longer and longer. I would love your point of view as a more like asset manager
on the publicly traded side. Yeah, it's a big issue. I mean, I think a big advance was the B corporation structure, which is anybody unfamiliar with B corporations or
benefit corporations?
I'm sorry, benefit corporations. Okay. It always confuses me.
They're very confusing.
So the benefit corporation is a different legal structure for a company, and it allows for things like how you treat your employees, what kind of office that you sit in, that gives you a way to look at multiple bottom lines as opposed to just providing a return to your shareholders. So it gives a much broader interpretation of what a successful business looks like. And the more that companies adopt that as a corporate structure, I think it gives them the ability to look a little longer term in terms of what they're returning. I think the biggest issue is not so much on the fund side. I think it is on the publicly traded side, which of course is where the bulk of assets live. And there is a lot of short-termism. It is very, very high pressure. The quarterly calls, the quarterly meetings, if you're familiar with that, is like a big deal in the market, and things react really dramatically. I do think having broader perspective, and I think the work that you're seeing now around trying to get not just more women on boards, but more people from different backgrounds and diversity, and I think that's really helpful, and I'm really interested in that work. I'm trying to figure out ways to cultivate that, because I think, I mean, if you look at some of the big financial crises, some of the companies that have performed the best are the ones that have had the most diversified board perspective and the ability to look beyond a really simple black and white number.
Great, thank you. Actually, you've had your hand up for a while, and the blue and red sweater? Yes, you, yeah.
Curious what you think about impact evaluation and how, I mean, I've read that before. I think about pay for success or social impact bonds, and I'm in the affordable housing world, and we are seeking impact investment. But how has that held up impact investing, and what is that looking like? It adds transaction costs, which has been sort of the thing that's really hung up pay for success. But just generally thoughts.
You guys have been working in that space. Do you want to start?
Yeah, so, I mean, we do use different frameworks. I think one of the challenges was that, you know, there was a time where it was like, you know, rigorous impact evaluation or nothing. So, like, you know, the cost of doing a randomized controlled trial, like, it's very high. But so we look at kind of like more like a progression. What can you do in the very early stages that is going to position you to demonstrate early impact, or at least that you have a theory of change of how you're going to get there, and start building internal capacity to then go into some of the more rigorous tests. For us, I think it's very important we try to align with our entrepreneurs on what are some of the business metrics that are also telling you something about the impact that you're having. And when you cannot prove in a rigorous way that additionality, at least what are your plans of getting there, and how you're building internally those capabilities. So we work on building a theory of change, but also building data analytics, building things like know your customer. I mean, it's shocking how many people think that like they're improving and they're not asking their customers. And the good news is that that's pretty, I mean, that's how a lot of like Silicon Valley companies build themselves. It's like focus on product, focus on your customer. And then if you have built some of that and you build data analytics capabilities in your venture, then when you're starting to grow, you can do some randomized controlled trials. What we've seen is a lot of people that have done nothing, and all of a sudden they're in like, ooh, now I need to prove this. And now the cost is gonna be huge, the culture, how you establish a learning culture. So what we try to do is work on that continuum as well with our entrepreneurs, like try to have this conversation that is like, take the burden, how this can be additive to your business, also to help you fundraise, to help you improve your offering, and then we will start connecting them with, you know, rigorous impact evaluation so they can do the trials. I think we've also backed some of these infrastructure plays in the industry, like on social impact bonds, on pay for success. I would say is challenging because you need a lot of stakeholders buying in, and I think, you know, part of it is the internal capabilities of these organizations, but also how you get to, you know, local or state governments to play ball, or the philanthropic dollars to come in. And many times instead of a social impact bond, we're seeing just pay for success, where we just have two parts of the equation, the organization and the philanthropic funding, because we're not there yet with more like the public sector funding. But,
if I could just add, so this is it's like one of the biggest questions in the impact investing field. When I was at Arabella Advisors, which is a philanthropic consulting firm, we spent a lot of time working with clients on their impact assessment, their measurement, their comparison, their reporting, the communication. Like the impact part of it was very important. And I would say that there have been some philanthropic dollars. Some of the very big foundations have stepped up with like trying to figure out methodologies that are applicable, that are comparable, that people can use. I would say the market feels to me now, like where we are currently in a 1.0 state, is most people can report on output. Like they can, if it's affordable housing, they can report on the number of units, they can report on the number of, women-led households that are taking advantage. So there's, if you have a charter school, they can report on number of butts in seats. This kind of thing is very reportable at the moment. The next stage, the 2.0 of impact, is really around the outcomes. Like, has that affected those households' living standards? Has it affected literacy? Has it affected general sort of state of being? Those kind of things are much, much harder to report. And if you have, one of the things that I struggle with my clients is typically they have impact investments across asset classes. And so your ability to report on impact on a private debt is going to be much, much different versus your S&P 500 type investment, right? So how you look at impact, it's hard to integrate. You can't roll it up onto a portfolio level, which most people want. We've experimented with everything from like little quantitative things like, oh, we'll rate things from 1 to 10, and then we'll give you a number at the end of your portfolio, which we thought was brilliant. And the client was like, oh my God, so boring. I hate this. It's ridiculous. And so we reverted back to like the one page, the stories, like this is what you did. You invested in this water company and then whatever. So it's very, very hard to do, but lots of people are experimenting with it right now.
And I'll add one thing, and then you get the next question in the back since I took it away from you a second ago. I'm sorry. But there's also there's a growing, it's not a backlash yet, but serious questions from serious people, including Angus Deaton, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist, calling into question the efficacy of randomized control trials on evaluating social and economic outcomes. They work great for clinical trials, but and when you just sort of get into the weeds of trying to understand how you randomize something, how you have the ethics of actually having a control group and a treatment group.
So like one neighborhood gets it and one neighborhood doesn't?
Yeah, and especially if it's something in a situation where there's a problem that is extremely acute and could lead to serious life disadvantages if you don't get the treatment for, I don't mean a medical treatment, but if you don't get the intervention even for 6 months. And so I would add for the audience that it's important actually to have a combination of the stories. RCTs remain the gold standard, especially if the goal is to get government to fund something. I don't believe that that's the right answer, but that's the status quo, and I think we need to evolve this. Yes, your question. Oh, there's a.
And in great part about the way capital markets view them. So I feel like
I'm sorry, what was the first word?
Hybrid organizations.
Hybrid organizations.
So having moved from the dichotomy of, you can only do well or do good. I feel like we've moved to a place where particularly young entrepreneurs are saying, I can have it all, and the organization that I'm going to create is going to be a hybrid. And I had a conversation with a young entrepreneur yesterday. I run a foundation, and one of our entrepreneurs who was doing a tech nonprofit is saying, well, we're going to move to a hybrid. And I feel like I'm also a reader for Echoing Green and for Big Ideas, and it seems like every single one of these young entrepreneurs says, I'm going to create a hybrid. And the notion of, well, you can actually have earned revenue in a nonprofit as well. These arguments, what I'm often hearing is, well, there's certain aspects of what we do that really lend itself to a nonprofit type of conversation and world and pace and scaling strategy, and there's other aspects that really lend itself more to a for-profit. So the question to you is how you feel the capital markets view those, whether you think there's some really good examples of hybrid organizations that have been able to execute on kind of both sides, and what you tell young entrepreneurs who say, no, I want to have it all, and really hybrid is the way I want to go.
So can I start really quickly? So I think the late, great Priya Haji, actually, I think World of Good was a hybrid organization. I think she had a not-for-profit part of her business and a for-profit part of her business, and it worked out delightfully for her business insofar as the for-profit part was purchased and the not-for-profit. I actually don't know what happened to the not-for-profit part of her business, but I think it was absorbed. And so I've spoken to a couple of early stage entrepreneurs that were looking at the hybrid structure, and I think most of their motivation was around wanting to build a for-profit business, but being really keen on raising not-for-profit grant dollars in the first couple of years. And so that was the rationale for it. So from that standpoint, that seems perfectly reasonable to me. I don't know that the capital markets look one way or the other at that. That seems very pragmatic. But I don't know if you guys have had experience with that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think a lot of people just want, and that was my clarifying question was hybrid in the idea of like for profit and non-profit structure, like legal structure, or just from
like having both, right?
Yeah.
Somehow having both.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a lot of nonprofits come to us with this idea, should I have this? And we've seen both ways, nonprofit becoming for-profits and for-profits becoming nonprofits. I think it's tricky. I think you need to know the reasons why you're doing it. And sometimes like the fundraising is just a little part of it. Sometimes you have private inurement issues where it's like when you're using nonprofit dollars to benefit your for-profit, which is like very, very tricky, particularly if your nonprofit just can't purchase from your for-profit. But we've also seen it the other way around, where the nonprofit maybe is the R&D and actually the agreement is with the for-profit, and actually that creates. I mean, I don't have a great answer because I think it's so much on a case-by-case basis. But what I'm like trying, and to this idea of the hype, many times I will go and be like, okay, what is a for-profit company, a for-profit entity allowing you to do that a nonprofit doesn't? Because you can generate revenue, you can be sustainable, you can be like more than 100% sustainability. Many times the issue there is attracting talent. And I think that's very acute in a place like Silicon Valley, for example, where, you know, like people may have options or salaries. And I think part of that is also how foundations operate. In general, foundations give a lot of programmatic funding, but not a lot of kind of like growth capital or OPEX. Like, no, I'm gonna give you money and it's okay if you spend it in hiring a kick-ass CMO and like investing in infrastructure and things like that. So I think that may be a way of solving for that. But I know a lot of people need to go that route because that's how they feel they can attract great talent and distribute some capital and things like that.
I will chime in to say I think hybrids are shiny objects that social entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs are attracted to, and it's often the cart before the horse. And people say, I want to do a hybrid because it sounds cool, and it's often a terrible strategic choice, and it's very hard to do right, and especially on the front end, incredibly difficult to get the governance right.
Yeah.
And positions both the for-profit and the nonprofit to do poorly in their core operations. Drift away from mission to support the business, drift away from business efficacy to support the mission. So I'm actually a doubter, and I've seen a lot of catastrophes in hybrid structure. Yes? Oh, we've got a microphone coming for you.
Okay, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I'm Dr. Kailash Gupta, and I'm a social entrepreneur, vigilance activist, and disaster researcher. So I started a non-profit, the International Emergency Management Society India chapter in 2015 to make activism about the awareness of the disaster. So for last 3 years, we have been doing a lot of good work, and one of our colleagues started a Operation Resilience, which is to software, which is to match demand and supply. In disaster, there is a demand of people who need all sorts of things. On the other side, there are people who are supplying, but there's most of the time around the world there is a mismatch. And this startup idea got one of the best awards from the government of India. And we did a lot of other things, a workshop with the Government of India Institute, and there's a Jaipur Literature Festival, which is the world's biggest free evacuation partner. But all those things we are doing. But for the money, you know, we have not been able to raise any money until now, last 4 years, and I've been putting my own money. And in India, and we want to reach to poor people who are looking for where do they get the next meal. They are not bothered about some earthquake which may happen in next 50 years, or you know. So how do I make my organization sustainable? And you know, we work with the government also. They all know, and but we are failing to do that. That's why I came here to get.
The question is how to make your enterprise financially sustainable?
Yeah, revenue generation. Until now, we have not charged any fees until now for anything. Even the workshop with the Government of India, organizations like FEMA, EMI, we organize, and we have to pay money for one of the auditorium and the lunch. We paid we means mostly I
Seems
paid.
like a question for the Omidyar.
So how do I, revenue generation and sustainability, yeah. That's okay.
And what I would be happy is if you want, like, after this, we can
Yeah,
sit
yeah,
down
more-
for
yeah,
15
okay.
minutes.
Yeah, he's your
and
guy.
we can talk.
Okay,
and we
okay.
can talk about it. Yeah. Because I think it's just, yeah, devil's in the detail. But what I would say is, like, what we've seen in some of these marketplaces, it's like, well, who wants to pay for this? And sometimes, like, you know, places like Donors Choose or Kiva, what they are asking is people that donate to donate a little bit more so they can help sustain the nonprofit that is, like, doing that. But we can discuss in more detail.
One more thing. One of the innovator who created this Operation Resilience, who won the prize, he got fed up and he joined an NGO program in his university in USA.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have a question all the way over here. Sorry. Okay. Oh, good. There's a microphone.
Me too.
I guess I am kind of resonating with a few of the things you said, which is, and I'm asking more about foundations and what you would like to see foundations doing or not. And one comment being that you see problems in a systemic way, and so you want, so you're using different kinds of capital for different kind of impacts. The other thing you talked about was that older people, you know, especially in foundations, are not, don't really, just don't see impact investing or alternative ways of investing beyond, say, grants as relevant. And so I guess my question to you is there, for those foundations, of which there are very many, in the philanthropic sector who aren't doing impact investings or other alternative kind of investings beyond grant dollars, what do you think they're missing? Like, what is the, is there a perspective about looking at problems systemically, or is there, you know, issues around, I mean, what do you think they're missing?
Are you addressing that question to me? I'm sorry.
To both
or
of
more
you,
to
actually.
Rafa. So it's interesting. You know, when I first started in this field, in the impact investing field, in the late 2000s, it was almost entirely high net worth individuals that were driving the impact investing field. It was almost entirely, usually a woman, like a really charismatic woman who had read something somewhere and felt that their family and foundation dollars should be directed in this fashion. So for the first half of my career, it was mostly working with individuals. And at that time, I thought, what are the foundations doing? This makes so much sense for them. They're already philanthropically inclined. It's already money that's intended for good. Why wouldn't they embrace impact investing wholeheartedly? And it turns out the issue isn't that they had missed something or didn't care, but that just when you have an institutional structure, it takes a longer time for change. Typically, you have a committee-based decision-making structure. Typically, you have more fiduciary responsibility. It's, you can pass around blame and accountability and almost nothing gets done in those kind of situations. And so it just took a long time. And then there was this sea change, probably maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, actually, where a number of the big foundations, FB Heron in particular, Ford Foundation, Kresge, Kellogg, a couple of these foundations, big foundations, stepped up and said, oh my God, we totally get it. It's time for us to do that. And that provided cover for a lot of the other foundations to start exploring it. And then I think it was 2 years ago that we had some regulatory change on the IRS code that made it much easier for foundations to start exploring. So all of that has started to accelerate foundations getting involved in the space. I was at the Confluence Philanthropy event this week here in Berkeley, and they're mostly family foundations, and I would say mostly medium size. And by medium, I mean 50 to $1 billion, basically, those size foundations. And it was packed. They had something like 300 foundations at this conference. And the entire agenda was around how to start implementing an impact investing strategy. So I think to some extent it takes time, it takes knowledge, it takes some data points, it takes some experience, it takes personnel. I mean, typically you have to have either in-house staff or you have to hire staff to build that kind of a strategy. So I think we're getting there. I think the big issue areas from my standpoint now are pension funds, which are globally the biggest purveyors of capital, have been very, very slow. You're starting to see a little bit of movement in that space. The sovereign wealth funds, same thing, big amounts of capital, very little interest in this space so far. So those are the next two areas to start knocking on doors and beating up people. I think.
Do you want to? Okay. Okay, the woman in the back. Yep.
This poor guy in the front here keeps wanting to ask a question, and you keep on ignoring him because he's right here.
I'm looking for geographic distribution.
Hi, thank you. My question is about mainstreaming a gender lens in impact investing. And it's traditionally seen as a constraint just because, supporting female entrepreneurs or trying to get into female BOP markets is just a little bit more difficult.
Yeah.
Do you think that conversation is shifting, especially considering you're saying women are leading from a foundations angle, that conversation that it's an opportunity instead of a constraint? Thank you so much.
So I think if you're a traditional investment manager, anything is a constraint, like anything beyond the entire universe is a constraint, and that's a bummer for a lot of investment managers because they want the full, if you look at traditional investment theory, the bigger the universe, the better for your risk-return proposition. The gender lens or looking at female empowerment or these kind of issues, it comes up every single day. I have that conversation every single day with my clients, and so it's a big, big issue area, and the way that people are thinking about it is different. I think the amount of tools that you have to affect a strategy like that have increased. Certainly on the public equity side, how you define gender lens investing has evolved, and so it used to be just kind of a numbers counting game, like how many women in senior leadership, how many women on boards, and it's gotten much, much more nuanced now in terms of like, are these goods and services that serve women and girls? Are these organizations that have been, that have 50% or have some gender equity around them? And then when you look into the private debt and equity side, then you start to really sort of dig into the ideas of what aspects of gender are they addressing. So I think it's become a much, much more interesting conversation. It's still a little bit complicated, and people define it in a lot of different ways, and it's probably still a constraint, but I literally have the conversation every single day. So I think it's going to increase in volume and in substance.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one is the gender lens when you have a strategy that is specifically to focus on that. But I think it's just, there's a lot of like appalling statistics, like in the space that I play, which is venture capital, it's like 2% of GPs, general partners in funds are women.
Right.
Like, if you enter in a room and you have, 5 white Ivy League males, like in the Monday morning meeting, and you're presenting, all those implicit biases are gonna play. So for me, a lot of it is also like how you attack it from that point of view. So for example, at Omidyar network, when I joined 6 years ago, we didn't have any female partners. Now 30% of our partners are female. In the education group, we have 3 partners. They're all women. And that shows, 40% of our portfolio is women entrepreneurs, more than 50% in the US. So I think that needs to start, it's very apparent to me that that's like, if you want more diversity in your portfolio, we need to work on the funnel. I think that's very important. There's an initiative that was launched this month called Start With 8, where you sign a pledge to meet with at least 8 women entrepreneurs outside of your existing network. But also you need to work with kind of like the institutional governance and constraint. I would love if CalPERS, a pension fund, comes in and is like, look, I'm only going to invest in GPs that have at least 1 female partner.
Yeah.
That will create like, so much change down the line. And I think we're very far, but hopefully we're getting there. And the same with other type of minority points of view. And you have, some funds that they're making that a competitive advantage.
Yeah.
I think Brian Dixon is going to be here this afternoon. If you look at the diversity in CalPERS Capital investment team, no wonder they're investing in great entrepreneurs that is not the ones that do the circuit here. So
That's a good point.
Great. All right. Finally.
A little bit on the other side of the greenwashing question. We're seeing some investment opportunities that are impact focused, not declare themselves impact investing, like Steve Case's Rise of the Rest Fund, and presumably someone who knows the nuances of impact investing. So what can we learn from the refusal to brand things impact investing, and what might that say about what impact investing is for the future?
That's interesting. It sounds like you have So I would say, I mean, I didn't actually realize that. I was familiar with what Steve, I actually went to Salt Lake City last year to participate in that, and I didn't realize that they were actually rejecting the notion of impact investing, but that's interesting. I mean, in my dream world, we won't be talking about impact investing in a few years. I mean, it should just be smart investing or better investing, or because I feel like it seems obvious to me that an investment that takes into consideration its environmental footprint or its governance structure or its accountability or transparency or all the things that we're trying to solve for just makes for a better investment longer term. So I would love it if we don't have this conversation in 5 years around impact investing because it's incorporated.
No, but I think it's true. If you talk, for example, we do a small percentage of our investments is in fund managers. And I just have like a specific industry in mind where we talk to a number of fund managers. We ended up making one investing in a fund manager that will consider themselves impact investor. They will brand themselves as such. And they had a tough time fundraising because for a lot of the traditional LP limited partner capital out there, they're like, oof, like, I need to hit my metrics. I need to make sure that you have X% IRR and cash on cash. Their projections were maybe more, I would say, not more realistic than the projections of another fund that is investing in the exact same space. This is an area where like most of the budget is public sector budget. So realistically, both are trying to like get into like an impact pool, if you will. But these managers went with a very aggressive, like, no, we're just investing in this sector, this is ripe, there's all these things, and it was easier for them to attract capital. I don't have all the other, like it's probably there's many more factors at play, but I think part of that is like a lot of traditional LPs are a bit concerned when they hear you flagging the impact.
Well, it could be another constraint, right? Like if you're doing a double or triple bottom line and you're solving for more than just a classic return structure, then it gets more complicated.
So and a lot of in emerging markets, a lot of entrepreneurs past certain stage, because the impact, again, there's a lot of impact dollars in early stages, but when they are trying to go into private equity, growth capital type of place, they kind of like tame that down.
Interesting.
And have different decks.
Are we coming up on time? Because it seemed like endless when we first started.
We're getting there, and we're going to end on like the almost cliche question of your guidance on your guidance to current or would-be investors and your guidance to entrepreneurs. But I'm not going to ask you to answer it yet. I'm just telling you now because I'm going to ask you that. And it's hard to do that one quickly. Yes.
So moving away from the traditional, say, ESG guidelines in that area, and more on a personal level, how would you define a single person's impact? What is an individual's impact? And how does that change once you abstract it away to a company's impact?
Oh, philosophical question. Rafa?
So you mean as an individual contributor in a firm, or?
In life? What's your life? What is your impact in the world?
Why are you here, Rafa? I mean, on Earth.
I mean, for me, like when I think about what I do, it's like I think the people are really doing the work are the organizations we support, and I think about myself as an enabler. Sometimes with capital, sometimes taking a board role, sometimes making connection. So that's how I think about my impact. I don't think I can claim any impact of any of the organizations that are doing it, but I'm hopefully removing some barriers. But
so I think about it on multiple levels. Like I think you have to live your day-to-day life. The more you know about pressing environmental and social changes, the more that you have to do personally. The way that I've kind of manifested it beyond work has been, I have a son who's now 19 at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I think you have to model, you have to train this next generation to be really, really mindful of consumption, of how he uses his car, how he treats people, how he treats girls, in particular women. So I think there's the modeling aspect, and then for me personally, one of the reasons I love organizations like GSVC or being involved with Haas has been, I think it's so important to be available, like to take the hard lessons that I've learned, that we've learned, and kind of convey them and share them with next generation leaders, because I think that's a great way to sort of amplify lessons. And so I'm hoping that just by showing up in places like this, that there's some impact. I'm hoping.
Yes.
My question is, what are your thoughts about data-driven investing in impact investing, using machine learning algorithms and so forth.
Using
machine learning algorithms, trying to use the data in a more effective way to make the impact investing decisions.
So I love data. Data is great. So I don't know if do you mean like in sort of public equities, like for example, a manager like a Perio that uses quantitative investing to create modeled portfolios that eliminate sort of harmful things, or do you mean?
That is one analogy. Another could be in the regular VC community, they are just starting to adopt these kind of different patterns to understand where to invest, and the signals are much more noisy than you consider seed. So once you get to the first and second rounds, it becomes much more easier to discern a pattern.
Oh, interesting. Huh, I don't know much about that. Rafa, do you?
Yeah, I know a few VC firms that they will basically like request some data, run it, and make a decision on whether they're investing or not versus, and it's a way sometimes to avoid biases versus like, oh, this is a very like shiny entrepreneur, or like it talks about the work. And I think that works in certain sectors. So I think in consumer internet, mobile investments, in SaaS, in certain things you can play that. I think a lot of the sectors where we care about, there's not that much data and it's not publicly available. So I think that's sometimes a little bit of a problem, and just getting the benchmarking right of what makes a company in this space, above average or the momentum, like it's kind of like the secret sauce of a lot of funds that will not share. So, but I think it's an interesting thing about the social sector if you can create some collaboration to think about that. The other thing is like, and I think it's the same with like how you do rigorous impact evaluations, is like all the services, the product offering is moving so fast that comparing apples to apples, it's very difficult. And I think, if I'm looking at an education business, very few look alike when you think about all the elements.
I mean, I like it for what Rafa brought up. I mean, in terms of we all have so many biases that a lot of them we're sort of unconscious of. And so if you can use data, or if you can use more of a methodical process and to eliminate some of your own biases, I think that's probably pretty powerful.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to say something with respect to that point. I'm involved in impact investing. And I've seen a number of cases where AI and So I'm involved in impact investing in the seed space, and I've seen a number of cases where AI and artificial intelligence and pattern recognition in particular bakes in the biases that already exist in the environment in our society. So it's a real danger, actually, I believe.
Huh. Interesting. Huh. Who knew?
Yes. Okay.
So the magic works.
Anyway, I've heard that with impact investing, for a lot of like different fields, it's kind of homogeneous, but then we get into the medical field, it's a whole different game, and a lot of impact investors, like they're good for like investing in research, full nonprofit philanthropy. We want to find the gene, want to find the cause. When it comes to products, when it comes to solutions, when it comes to medications, I've heard that impact investors are like, we'll just leave that more to the typical funding routes. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So I don't know many impact investing firms that are like squarely in biotech and things like that. I know the Charles Zuckerberg Initiative actually has made one investment in a company called Meta, which is trying to accelerate discovery, but most of their budget actually is nonprofit for research. So I think that would be right. I think it's just such a specialized knowledge. Like, if I can explain something to my investment committee about what they are doing in a couple of minutes, and we don't have the in-house technical expertise, I think I will make a terrible investor, also in trying to support that company. So, yeah.
I think there's thematically, healthcare, medicine often falls into an impact investing bucket because you're trying to improve people's lives, and socially that seems like a good thing. So I have seen some private equity funds that have that as one of their thematic areas. They have education, healthcare, and there's almost an assumption that because it's in healthcare, it is an impact theme. But I think Rafa is right. You don't see a lot of people have specialized as impact investors into that space because it does have so many it does require so much specialization. There are some regulatory aspects to it that most investors aren't that familiar with. So it seems like it's falling less into an impact investing thing and more into a very specialized medical healthcare investment sector. If that makes sense.
I have a question. It's one we were talking about earlier. So, you know, we're in the 10th year of a cycle, at the top of the cycle. You could likely map the growth of assets under management labeled impact to the growth of this cycle. What's going to happen when we start the bottom of the next cycle?
Yeah.
What do you see happening with regard to this? And I'm especially curious about the question of, like, are we still going to see a focus on impact in non-emerging markets? Because it's arguably easier to do that in a place where there really is such a broken market or a non-existent market that is truly impactful and falls in that category. What are your predictions there?
I mean, I think the good thing for me is the conversation is becoming more nuanced. So maybe we're going to go to a place where it's like, you know, in this sector, this is not the type of capital that you need. And in this other sector, it works. And I think we're talking more about asset classes instead of, like, you know. And I do believe that's an interesting, I'm answering a different one, but I do not agree with the idea that impact investing is very good for emerging markets, but not for a market like the US. If you think about education in the US, more than 50%, which is of kids, are in free and reduced lunch in this country, which is really, really depressing. So if you are making investments in education in the US, your big clients are public school districts. And a lot of these urban public school districts, they are the juicier clients. If you take like a pure commercial approach, have even higher proportion of free and reduced lunch kids. So affordable housing, I think it's like a very important market if you take a local lens here in the Bay Area. Healthcare. So I do believe that that lens can apply a lot to like, you know, like a lot of like our economy and other developed economies. And I'm just hoping that there's more investors that maybe take a bit more of that lens.
So I would say, you know, I think it could go both ways, Ben. You know, when I first started in the impact investing field, it was right during the financial crisis when things were so depressed and so hard. It was so hard to envision a way towards making money. And the way that I sold, as it were, my first client on the idea of looking at microfinance and impact investing in 2008 was the idea that it was diversifying. That is to say, he was really, really interested in getting into emerging markets, and we had sort of traditional investments in his portfolio already. And I said, well, look, I've been reading all this stuff, and it looks to me like microfinance and some of these other early stage impact investments might look different. They might behave differently, which in fact they did, actually, because if you look at the financial crisis, because microfinance was so uncorrelated to Bear Stearns or any of the things that blew up in that market, it actually did quite well. I mean, those funds were up 5 or 6% when the rest of the markets were down 30 or 40%. So it's possible that, you know, when the top comes off the US markets and some of the big equity markets, that people will look to diversify into different kinds of asset classes and different kinds of strategies, and therefore impact investments might become more attractive. I think on the fossil fuel front, which is a big issue area for a lot of people looking at the environment, how oil prices, how stranded assets, how a lot of these kind of issues play out over the next few years, well, those are typically a big portion of an equity index, right, the fossil fuels. And so if you do or don't invest in them, it's going to be very dramatic how those indices do, because those companies will dramatically affect those prices. So I'm not sure how that will go. It's very possible that people will become more discerning when the markets are less easy. When it's easy to make money, probably your path of least resistance is you just throw it into the markets that are going up and you're so happy and you can give more on the other side. But when the markets are flat and or declining, you might be more rigorous around what you're investing in. So it could be a benefit.
Great.
Hopefully.
Thank you. Yes.
Question revolves around a few things that have been touched upon, I would say, but I wanted to dig a little deeper. Predominantly education and the importance of educating the next generation of leaders, and also the hype of impact investing, the hype of like XYZ. So as a young student, it's actually really interesting to see industry trends kind of trickle down and see students kind of shift their focus onto whatever seems to be the trend of the moment. And I think with a field such as impact investing, that's actually really dangerous, because so much of impact investing depends a lot on understanding the context of the issues we're looking into, like the foundational knowledge, and not just, I want to go into impact investing because like there's a demand for that. So my question, I guess, is how do we kind of shift the educational model to really teach students about like the foundational knowledge they need to be impact investors, as opposed to like, I want to go into finance and like this is kind of niche, so I'm going to pick that, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. I'll just start, I mean, and this comes back to, I think you had set us up to say what would our advice be, and so this plays into that. I mean, I would say, I mean, I'm a little bit old school too that way insofar as I grew up in the traditional investment space, and I think when I'm looking to hire people or if I'm evaluating an outside collaborator, them having really, really solid fundamental, like basic investment skills, their ability to actually like put together a model to look at a company has to come first. Like their love and desire to do impact in the world is important, but they have to be able to actually evaluate a company or a business or a fund or a prospective investment first. And so I'm sure you guys are teaching this here already, Ben, but you know, you have to be a very, very smart, a very thoughtful investor. And then the impact piece is just additional, like you have to do that also. And so in theory, you should be a better investor over time is how I would think about that.
And I think if I take it, your question in a different way, which is like, what are things you could be doing? I mean, impact investing is like such a small sliver of everything that you can do in the social sector space. True. And I think, you know, like there's great nonprofits out there. You can become a social entrepreneur. You can do so many things. But I think proximity, be proximate with the problems that you're trying to solve. I get so many people that come and pitch us, and it's like, well, you're trying to solve a problem in a slum in East Africa, like you know, like, and there's a lot of opportunities if you're a Berkeley student here to be very proximate with real problems in the Bay Area. So just be proximate, and that will be a way for you to figure out what issue areas you really care about. If it's education, you know, there's a lot of great programs here in the East Bay where you can get involved, and I think that will give you that ignite and that passion, and you will be deciding like, well, do I want to be in a foundation or want to be on the trenches? Or so I that's what I also like encourage everyone, particularly students. Like it's a great time to experiment, but nothing beats being where you really want to affect change instead of being here talking about it.
When you say proximate, you mean like physical proximity?
Yes.
Not
so
like
you care about
philosophical.
Like, you know, yeah, you care about education, go to schools in Oakland, see how they are, like get involved as an after-school tutor, like do that type of thing. You care about like prison reform, like there's a lot of like nonprofits that work with that type of population, and I think, you know, that would be my advice for everyone.
So keeping on the theme of advice, and it'll be the last question before we break, what else would you offer to the investors in the room, the would-be investors in the room, and you just gave a great answer to the would-be social entrepreneurs to some degree about proximity to the problem. But any other closing thoughts?
So I have two, and these are hard-fought and hard-won lessons that I offer to you. One is that you really have to know yourself, and I know many of you are very young and you have not been out there, you haven't been slapped around by the world yet, but you will, and learn from those. I mean, I can't tell you how powerful it is to know your own know yourself, what's important to you, what kind of environment do you thrive in, what kind of people do you like to work with, what kind of mistakes do you keep making over and over again. So it's really, really good to know yourself, because that will help you make decisions around where you will best serve. And then secondly, I think one of the things that I have learned over and over in my career is who you surround yourself with is very, very important, because I think when you're young, you look at a job title, or you look at a salary, or you look at like the corner office, and that's what you're solving for. Like, oh my God, I get the corner office, it's amazing. But if you're working with assholes, if you're working with people that you hate, that you're not value aligned with, that don't make your heart sing, that's not gonna be a good fit. And so I think when I'm offering people advice and they're comparing jobs, for example, or thinking about different sectors, find people that you admire and respect and like, because those are the people that I think, jobs change, companies change, social enterprises, they start and they fail pretty often. And so if you can build around you a group of people that you love that will take you from this step of your career to the next step, I think that will be really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I would go with that. Yeah. I think what you want to prioritize for some people, the industry is very important. For some people, is the type of people you're working with, is the impact, the day-to-day work, and I think knowing yourself, where do you draw energy, and try to do more of that, where you are energized by the work that you're doing. That's probably going to be a very good North Star to figure out where you want to play.
Thank you so much, Julia and
My pleasure.
Rafa.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us.